Hello, I'm Reverend Mel Caraway. I'm past president of the board of directors of Texas Impact, and I currently serve as the Interfaith Climate Coordinator for our affiliate, Texas Interfaith Power and Light. As an active member of the U.S. faith climate advocacy community, I've attended several previous sessions of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. These conferences of the parties are commonly known as COPs, and this year's meeting is COP 28. This year I've opted not to attend in person. Instead, I am following the conference online, and that is something you can do as well. You can follow COP online by accessing the QR code on the screen. It will take you to the COP platform where you can see menus of all the sessions, many of which are being archived as on-demand webcasts that you can watch at your convenience. And here's the second QR code. It's for a special list of side events. Side events are workshops and panels on a wide range of topics, and they include presentations by academics, climate advocates, as well as representatives of impacted communities. Yesterday, we talked about the Local Climate Action Summit. We heard world leaders say how important subnationals are, and policy experts are in agreement. Let's listen to Dr. Nate Hultman, founder and director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland.
As Helen said, my name is Nate Hultman. I'm the director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, and very excited to be here. We are all here with a shared vision toward ambitious climate action to deliver vibrant economies, clean and just energy transitions, and broadly shared benefits. And as we do this, we are addressing today at this session several critical questions. How can state and regional governments, in partnership with national governments and other actors across all of society, drive rapid climate advancements? How can we improve the flows of climate finance to the subnational level? How can states, regions, and other non-party stakeholders support the design of more ambitious NDCs? And how can national governments better partner with subnational governments to implement them? We know there is a lot of work to be done to answer those questions, but as we pause to take stock this year of progress since Paris, we are also able to draw from recent years of experience and learning in how these actions can be implemented effectively. And having seen the results of the energy and commitment you all are delivering, it is clear that we can, through this all-of-society approach, we can achieve a 1.5 degree aligned pathway, and the key is all of you. The analysis we have undertaken, and that I will present briefly, underscores this, but the key lessons go well beyond this one illustration, and ultimately, the goal of such assessments is to identify areas where we can jointly work together to make improvements rapidly to enable us to reach those goals together. So can we go to the first slide? Yeah. So many of you have seen this already. This year, of course, marks the first global stock take under the Paris Agreement, a moment where we have been called collectively to take stock of where we are in light of the climate crisis and answer the question, are we on track to achieve our climate goals? Particularly, are we on track to keep warming to 1.5 degrees? And while there are many ways to answer this question, I think we all know that, regrettably, we are not yet on track. But we also must remember that the story is not yet complete. The window remains open for success, and we therefore must add something to that answer, the answer not yet. And in this room and the many other emergent partnerships around the world are going to be part of our success in achieving it. The stocktake has been informed by both scientific assessments and a broad dialogue and political process that many of you have been participating in. This process importantly identified success in the substantial global acceleration of action under the Paris architecture, as represented by the substantial change in overall global trajectories, as you can see on the figure above. Let us pause and note that this is genuine and significant progress that many people dismissed as unrealistic before Paris. So I think that's really important to note. We are making progress, we are experimenting, we are finding ways to be more successful. Of course, it's also highlighting the need for immediate action to address two key deficiencies we've all heard: The first is the emissions gap, which refers to the difference between current emissions trajectory and what would be needed to achieve climate goals. And the second is the implementation gap, referring to the difference between existing goals and the actual observed pace of change. The critical question that emerges from the global stocktake then is whether we can raise, not whether we should raise ambition, but how. We are past the time to simply say we must do more or be more ambitious. We have to build the action, build the support, and build the political awareness and commitment from the bottom up. Next slide, please. Addressing these emissions and implementation gaps will require continued transformation not only of global technology and economic pathways, but to get there we also need a different kind of innovation. That is innovating on the processes by which we generate and support new policies and action. The innovation comes through an all-of-society approach, linking policy creation and implementation at all levels of government with engagement from actors and sectors across all of society. Notably, the preamble to Paris itself invokes the importance of the engagement at all levels of governance and various actors. This partnerships, which our panelists to be coming up on stage shortly embody, is the key to just, rapid, and durable transitions tailored to diverse country contexts that achieve global climate goals. For example, in recent years, our own work with many US partners in the Americas All-In Coalition has focused on raising ambition and implementation effectiveness through an all-of-society approach in the United States. We've also used these tools to address how similar strategies across all countries, fusing national and subnational actions, can deliver a 1.5 aligned pathway and keep our shared goal of 1.5 in reach. So let me share just a bit about this study as an illustration of the impact of this type of partnership. We analyzed over 500 policies and identified 11 key policy levers across all sectors in greenhouse gases. You can see from the figure here that mobilizing around these key all-of-society levers can keep a 1.5 degree pathway within reach. The global all-of-society pathway requires rapid action along 11 key policy levers in all key emitting countries over the next few years, in addition to targeting methane and other short-lived climate pollutants within this decade to limit the peak temperature, minimize residual emissions, and ramp up carbon dioxide removal options towards 2050. Next slide, please. I'd also like to acknowledge, this is a multi-authored report led by Dr. Rina Tsui, and let's highlight a few of the 11 key policy levers here. Each of these can serve as a locus for all of society partnerships that span from national to state or regional and to city and municipal levels of government. And we assessed how organizing around these levers can deliver rapid retooling of economies needed by 2050. For example, in line with current conversations about tripling of renewables, the 1.5 aligned pathway based on a threefold increase in total solar and wind installed capacity also requires a rapid phase down of nearly 60% in unabated coal power generation. Other policy levers include rapid policy implementation to achieve reductions in enhancements of new car passenger sales, new truck sales from electric vehicles, phasing out solid fuels and phasing down gas consumption to 12% in buildings, increase of 26% of energy, a decrease of 26% of energy use from electricity in industry, maintaining natural forest area, and many more. Next slide, please. To achieve these significant emissions reductions, progress needs to be made across all of these different levers, and these are the areas that, combined with cities, states, businesses, and other all-of-society actors, we can make progress on immediately. So we've talked about renewables and electricity generation, but the power and transportation sectors probably hold the most potential for subnational actors to drive emissions rapidly, while business actors can lead in the building sector. National governments, of course, play a key role in setting policy priorities, establishing market trends, and investing in new and emerging technologies to support action across all levels of governance. Leadership is also critical in hard to decarbonize sectors, especially when further technological policy development is needed for progress. Looking to 2050, ambition across all actions must be ratcheted toward net zero emissions as fossil fuels are phased out from electricity and end use, and new technologies are made commercially available for alternative fuels and hard to abate sectors. Next slide. So this slide highlights one aspect of critical areas of action as a final focal point for my comments today. Rapid action in non-CO2 greenhouse gases is going to be particularly important. Immediately and large-scale abatement of methane emissions, for example, is going to be key to limiting peak warming in the 2030s and 40s. And for all of us working here together today, action in those areas will be critical to keep peak warming to a minimum in these coming decades. There are large opportunities and temperature impacts of targeted mitigation of non-CO2 gases in the near term. Methane-focused mitigation efforts in particular can lower peak temperature by about 0.06 degrees Celsius by 2035 already, compared to just a CO2-focused strategy. In conclusion, as the world seeks to build an effective strategy to respond this year to the global stocktake, we will now embark on assessing opportunities in all of our countries for all of society action for the next round of NDCs. To do this, let's learn what is working well from our new model of all of society partnerships and action across national governments, states, regions, cities, counties, tribal governments, as well as private sector and other groups. Next slide, please. So I'd like to just conclude with thank you to all of you. Let's accelerate, expand, and deliver the success we need. Thank you very much.
Now let's hear from several leaders representing states and regions. These leaders are in somewhat of a sandwich position, not as close to the ground as the cities, but still not in control of their own destinies. As you'll hear, this can often be a source of frustration. First up today from Scotland is Humza Yousef. He is the First Minister of Scotland.
Look, from my perspective, if you want things done, devolve the powers down to those at local level. Because again, we know, and we've heard this statistic repeated time and time again, 80% of adaptation, of mitigation happens at a local level. But also it's not just about that, it's about, I think, the fact we see the impacts at a local level. We feel the political pressure as well from our local communities who are demanding we go further, go faster. And therefore you see that implementation take on a different pace compared to the glacial pace that we see, unfortunately, far too often from national governments. I mean, to the point that we're at COP28, 28, and we still can't agree language about fossil fuels, when everybody knows what we need to do in relation to fossil fuels. We all know that we need to phase out fossil fuels. We need that just transition towards renewable and clean energy in relation to net zero. And yet, the national governments in the world are arguing over apostrophes and commas, and we're getting on with the work that needs to absolutely be done. I think if we genuinely just thought about it for a moment, if every power was reserved to a national government, think about the state our planet would be in at the moment, to be frank. So we know that at a national level we can move. In Scotland, we've got world-leading climate change targets. We're able to we've moved ahead with banning single-use plastics in relation to implementation of low-emission zones or workplace parking levy, so on and so forth. So we can use the powers that we have. I think the challenge for us as a devolved government, and I'm sure this will be true for all of my colleagues, is we shouldn't just stop the devolution of power there. We should keep That's a cheer for that. See, you heard. We should keep devolving even further right to the communities themselves, because if we think we act quickly, well, they will act even quicker. So I think that's the first challenge, is continue to devolve power down right to the grassroots, right to our communities, not to stop them in Edinburgh, for example, in Scotland. And then the million-dollar question is how do we ensure that the transformational powers that are still reserved to national governments, so for Scotland's perspective, that is around energy market reform. If we really want to power our renewable technologies, how do we incentivize them to devolve that power further? And I think that they're not going to do it of their own volition. And that's why it's so crucial at this COP that we ensure that subnational governments are inherently involved in the negotiations, not as just part of a summit or side events or fringe events, but actually when it comes to particularly COP29, COP30 in Brazil, how are we inherently involved, and how is it understood by national governments that if they want to meet their targets, then they've got to empower us to be able to do that. Because we've already demonstrated how we've done it to this point, we can go a lot further and a lot quicker and a lot faster.
Next, we're going to hear from Thelka Walker, who talks about how her regional government is using a combination of incentives and mandates. Thelka Walker is the Minister of the Environment, Climate Protection and Energy of the state of Baden-Wurttemberg in Germany.
Well, I mean, I just, at first, I want to say that I strongly support what you have said, and the others too. And I think it's very important if we want to have, at first, we need good examples of regions, of cities that already achieved a lot. Because if we only look at the national level, it seems to be it's very difficult to get forward. It's slow, and we have a lot of discussions if it is really good for the economy and all that. And I think we need to be counted, really. We need to be a accountable part of the whole ambition to achieve net zero in 2050 or 2040 or whenever it is achievable. And I think it's good to be here today for the first time, to be heard in the whole process. But it shouldn't be a side act, you know. It should be really, a part that is counted. And not only counted, I think we also need investments, for those regions that don't have the support of the national government. I think that's very important. I mean, Germany is, I would say, is on track right now with our national government, but it can also change the next years. And we try, for example, to phase out coal right now in Germany. That is very ambitious and not that easy because of the war in the Ukraine. Last year, we had to burn more coal as we wanted. So our reduction of emissions is not as good as we wanted it to be. So it's not very easy, but still the government says, yes, okay, we stay on this track. But it can be different the next 2 years or 3 years. And so for us, it is very important that the regions themselves have support, have a network, are counted. And so I just can support this point. And every region has, of course, its own possibilities, problems, and solutions. But they can also be a pattern for others. Yeah, it's not totally different. I mean, we took from California, I guess, the obligation for the rooftops, the photovoltaics. That was an example from California. Our obligation for municipal heat plants was from Denmark, because Denmark already in the 70s decided, after the first oil crisis, to phase out oil and gas and everything. So they're much, much more further than we are. And that's very important. We are doing it right now in Baden-Württemberg. We're having plans for all huge cities in Baden-Württemberg, heat plans and how to get them net zero until 2040. And we are the first country in Germany with these plans everywhere. So you can see how we will do it with heat pumps, maybe. Some think we can do everything with green hydrogen. I don't think so. We need electricity, of course, too. But that's what I wanted to say to that what was already said here in the round.
Thank you.
Now moving to the United States, we hear from Wade Crowfoot. He is the state of California's Secretary of Natural Resources. In this clip, he talks about progress and the challenges that face California. And he also announces a new state initiative.
From my perspective, look, let's first acknowledge progress. You know, the breakthrough 5 years ago with the Paris Agreement, the fact that nation states, through this treaty, put themselves on a target to reduce emissions. I think as we learned from our colleague from Maryland, there's still a need for greater ambition. But I talk about this as an implementation crisis, and the global stocktake is a wake-up call. 5 years later, we are not meeting the targets set in Paris. And so the question is, how do we as a world do that? And from where I sit, the United Nations FCCC process needs regions, states, provinces, and cities to play a more central role in this international process that brings us to Dubai today. Simply put, our governments are on the front lines, not only of the climate impacts, but on implementation. And Champ, as you point out, federal governments change and their commitments change. Look at my country of the United States over the last two presidential cycles. Look at Brazil. Look at Australia. And if we have to rely on the changing political winds of national governments to achieve these targets, we will not succeed. The fact is, colleagues in Scotland, in Korea, in Germany, in Australia, around the world, we have binding legal targets. 100% clean energy, net zero. Why not institutionalize those targets within the UN Convention? Not as a challenge to the nation states, not as a counterpoint, but as an additional sort of complementary effort, a belts and suspenders approach, if you will. So I'm really excited with the work that we're all doing together. I do think that what's being announced here this week called CHAMP, which 60 countries have signed on to, is a start. That is, national governments need to consult with their subnational governments, but let's not recognize that as a solution. Because I can tell you in my country, if we were to have a different president, theoretically a president that we've had in the past, I don't think he and his administration would be consulting with the state of California. So from our perspective, we need more institutionalized role here. Whether it's in the discussions around how to increase ambition, or as I put it, to allow us to submit subnationally determined contributions that we can be held accountable for.
Our Texas Impact team on the ground at COP28 got a chance to visit with Secretary Crowfoot. Let's listen to what he has to say.
The United Nations Convention on Climate Change is essentially a treaty among 198 countries to identify what they will do to limit carbon pollution and combat climate change. And that convention and these conference of parties that take place every year arguably has made a lot of progress. In Paris, the world came together and identified a framework where nations determine how they're going to reduce pollution toward a collective goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now that was progress. But here in Dubai, we've been issued a wake-up call, and it's called the global stocktake. And what it's showing is that we collectively are not making fast enough progress to actually meet the Paris Agreement. And that's where subnational governments come in, and that's cities, states, provinces, and regions. Simply put, places like California and so many other governments around the world are actively implementing policy, programs, investments that are reducing pollution. The challenge is, in this UN process, we have zero official role. Our governments are essentially treated like just broad non-governmental stakeholders. And we need to find a way to be more central to this process, because now we face an implementation crisis where there are targets, and we can get more ambitious with the targets, but we're not meeting those targets. And it's our governments that are on the front lines actually reducing pollution. So we're here in COP respectfully but strongly to demand a role for our governments in this process. And we don't do that to create conflict with our nation states or with the UN framework. That still is important, but it needs to evolve, recognizing that we're in a new chapter, and that is, how do we implement this tremendous transition we have to make? And so that's what's being actively discussed here in Dubai.
Secretary Crowfoot also made some observations about the differences in circumstances between California and other states.
In the United States, subnational governments, that is states and cities, are very important because, as we've seen, our federal leadership changes, and depending on who the president is, we have very differing approaches to combating climate change. So from our perspectives, cities and states need to be unleashed to actually advance climate action. Now, that happens in places like California, but it also happens across the country in cities like Houston, Texas, like New Orleans, Louisiana, like Miami, Florida. In states that aren't necessarily aggressive on climate action, we have cities that are taking action. So this whole subnational movement is about ensuring that local leaders, local communities can actually take tangible action. And the idea here in Dubai, why we're half a world away talking about this, is institutionalizing that progress from cities, from states, because we know it's going to help us move further and faster, regardless of who's in the Oval Office. Here in Dubai, there are 100,000 people talking about how we move further and faster to combat climate change. And while sort of the central concentric circle are national governments that are negotiating, there are legions of leaders, some in subnational governments like California, but some in civil society organizations and activists. And my message is, we all matter. We just heard from the leader of Scotland that said politicians, including himself, he said, are very simple animals. They count votes. And so those of us that know we need to act on climate need to make our voices heard. We need to continue to press for change, whether it's in our city, our state, our country, and we need to take action in our own lives. All of it matters.
Well, friends, that's our show for today. Tomorrow, we hope you will join us again as we check out a special event on greening America's cities, and we hear from several local officials who are attending this year's COP. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.